I'm Joe Flood with Joe Flood Insurance, protecting what matters.
And I'm Chad Latour from Flood Risk Solutions, where innovation meets flood coverage.
And this is the Flood Brothers Podcast.
We'll guide you through flood insurance trends
and keep you dialed in on market changes. All right, and we're back for our third installment of Flood Brothers with my flood brother, Chad. Chad, how are you?
Doing well. How you doing?
Well, I'm better now that the government's reopened, and we have a special guest here to talk to us about all things legislative, NFIP legislatively, and that is Nathan Riedel, the SVP of Federal Government Affairs at the Big I. And Nathan, thanks for being a guest here with Chad and I.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be with you guys today.
Awesome.
Yeah, the timing couldn't be better.
Yeah, it really couldn't. So the government is now open, and literally, we're recording this here on November 13th. So for those that are viewing after that date, we know that the government's fully reopened. The NFIP is selling policies again, but there's a lot to recap that's gone on over the last 40 odd days of a government shutdown. Nathan, what's next, right? We have the CR. It's a short-term extension. Talk to us a little from your perspective. Maybe, give us a short history of kind of where your perspective has been at the Big I and what we're looking at here going forward.
Yeah, well, the CR, the government shutdown went on for longer than we anticipated it. I think both sides agreed that there needed to be a shutdown because there were politics at play. Both sides needed to dig in a little bit, and especially on the Democratic side, needed to show their base that they were fighting, right? Because it's been a more kind of a rougher year for them with a new president coming in and getting a lot of wins. So we thought it would be shut down for a couple of weeks. Unfortunately, that went on much longer, right? 43 days at the end of it. And this continuing resolution, the CR that they passed, punted it to the end of January. So we're going to be back doing this again in less than 3 months, going through the same exercise, whether it's funding the federal government or reauthorizing the NFIP. So unfortunately, we may have some more dark days ahead. But I think this entire exercise has really brought more awareness to the need for reforms to the NFIP.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting, and so you see, you're in your crystal ball. Do you see possible fights on, the January CR and possibly having to do this again, or what do you see possibly coming if you could make a guess?
Well, if I'm guessing, I don't think it will be quite as difficult. I think a lot of that angst and pent up aggression they got it out through this one, so. I don't want to say we won't have another shutdown, but I think the odds are less likely now that we will. And so, knock on wood, we'll be able to come to an agreement before that 11th hour when it expires.
Right.
So Nathan, coming off the back of the longest shutdown in U.S. history, what are some of the impacts that you're seeing?
Yeah, just there's definitely a backlog right now. If we go beyond the NFIP, we just got to talk, from a 10,000 foot level. I mean, air traffic headaches there are still happening. We're going to see those probably happen up, through the holidays. Some of those headaches, right? Because you saw a significant number of people say, "I don't want to deal with this," and just retire. So that creates a backlog. It's also created a backlog when you look at Congress, right? The House wasn't in for a month and a half. And that meant other important things that Congress usually does, whether you're talking about committee hearings, legislative activity, oversight, of different departments and agencies. That stuff wasn't happening. So now you have about a 6-week backlog where they need to handle other things, right? Beyond like the NFIP, beyond funding, just general, duties that Congress has.
Got it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there were some questions, the CR certainly put us into January, but initially there were some questions on whether the CR was retroactive. Where we saw some stuff that's confirmed, right? It brings the NFIP back retroactively.
Yes, that's something we were nervous about, right? We had spoken to people verbally, and we had never seen a lapse for very long in the NFIP, right? Usually you were looking at maybe 12 hours, maybe a day.
Right.
So we were in uncharted territory, right? And there was a question as to whether or not Congress needed to specifically make it retroactive, or whether that was something FEMA could do, more regulatorily. So we did get confirmation today that it was retroactive, as written in the text, and obviously that's huge, as you guys know, right? If it wasn't retroactive, policies wouldn't be in effect until the day it was reauthorized. But now we can go back to October 1, as those policies take effect.
Yeah, we pretend it never happened.
Yeah. It would be nice to wipe it clear of our memories, right?
Yeah,
right?
the mental scars. There's too many
Yeah.
mental scars.
I have to say it has been good for business in the private space for sure. And Joe and I were talking earlier about this. It's interesting because it seems like I guess the lenders have really become more relaxed and maybe even used to these government shutdowns. And it seems as though things were still flowing. Like, did you see that from your perspective?
Yeah, we didn't hear as much about it as we thought we
Yeah.
might. And I guess that really was the onus was placed on the lenders, as you say, whether or not to determine if flood insurance was necessary on some of these closings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it seems like the private market did a pretty good job of absorbing some of that, that normally would have gone to the NFIP. Now, I did bring up, some concerns as we're looking at the future of the program. Not having continuous coverage in the NFIP, right? As we try and encourage more people to move to the private market and dip their toe in that water.
Mm-hmm.
We really need a continuous coverage guarantee that if they don't like the private market, they're able to jump back into the NFIP without penalty or without absorbing that full rate. So that'll be, one of the things is, like I mentioned earlier, I think there's some lessons being learned as we come out of this, and some things that I think Congress can do to make the NFIP better. I don't know if they'll ever make it, fully solvent, because it absorbs those high risks
Right.
that the private market may not want to get into. But there are things like continuous coverage that I think they could do relatively pain-free.
Right. Couldn't agree more. They actually had that, right? They did it for what, 30 days, or I don't remember the exact time frame, and then they rolled it back for one reason or another. But yeah, I think we definitely need to see that in the future to make this a more viable, option going forward. So, so it's funny because they always say that, these long-term reauthorization, right? Like, where do you see that, heading as we come upon another, 2-month extension, 2.5-month extension?
Yeah, I would love to tell you that we have a 7-year or 10-year reauth teed up. This is where you get into the challenge of the program not being financially solvent, right? When we saw with Katrina, a long time ago, right? It took a huge hit, and then it takes years to dig out of that hole, right, where it goes into the red. And so I know a lot of fiscally conservative, legislators here in D.C. are weary of the long-term reauthorization because they don't want to keep losing money. The reality of it is, I don't want to say that's the intent of the program, but I don't think the program can ever be viewed as a money maker, because it is that, kind of last risk, or that last resort for risk. We're definitely advocating for it. We have some good champions on the Hill. I mean, you have the two leaders of the House of Representatives coming from Louisiana, and Speaker Mike Johnson and Republican leader Steve Scalise. They certainly understand the need for certainty when we're talking about the NFIP, as they're hearing from their constituents regularly. And I know they don't like running this up to the deadline and going past the deadline and having it lapse in authority, because they hear about it from their constituents, and no member wants to hear complaints from their constituents.
Yeah, that's always a problem, right?
Yeah.
you don't want that feedback, especially in a state that is, one of the highest policy counts within the NFIP.
Right. Now, we will keep advocating for that. That'll be part of the Big Eyes talking points whenever we're meeting with members of Congress, when we do our fly-ins to DC, and we bring critical mass here to DC to lobby Congress, we will continue to ask for a minimum of 7-year reauthorization of the NFIP, because to go through this is the 34th short-term reauthorization of the program, and it just doesn't bring certainty to the insurance industry, to the housing, real estate markets. I mean, everybody wants a long-term reauthorization, so we've got to band together and make it happen.
Well, and that was what I was going to say. I think Chad and I both have had, offline discussions between each other that have basically said people are the biggest talking point of the NFIP has always been its certainty to always be there, right? Mm-hmm. When the private market kind of ebbs and flows on, what areas it likes to ride or rates or anything like that, the NFIP is a, congressionally mandated program that has certain rate increases at certain times and all those benefits. But we're starting to see potentially, at least I've heard, and Chad has too, that dialogue is starting to shift a little bit where people are saying, well, maybe the NFIP isn't the safest place to, be able to park the business because of, examples like this. So I think it's, to your point, Nathan, this long-term sustainable, reauthorization where the NFIP becomes, kind of a pillar versus this thing that people have to worry ebbs and flows is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And, to that point, there are a couple bills that have floated around recently within the last, I'll say, 6 months or so. Some of them are reforming the NFIP in different ways, right? Affordability, and I think one of them was even some type of tax credit or something. And there were some others that have, the continuous coverage bill, of course, has come and gone several times. What going into at this point next year and even into the next Congress? I mean, what type of traction will those even have? In addition to getting a long-term extension, obviously that being priority, but there's of course other places that have been long sought with those that want to see the NFIP kind of continue.
Yeah, I think we're at a spot where we have some decent traction. There's interest, like I said, among Congress. You look at the Senate Banking Committee chair, Tim Scott from South Carolina, a flood-prone state. He's a former insurance agent. He certainly is interested in this. His number 2 on that committee is Mike Rounds, who ran the second largest Big I agency in South Dakota before he was elected to the U.S. Senate. So we have, good subject matter experts, people with knowledge, on the Senate and the House side. I think the word that you hit on that's important and a lot of members will be looking at as we move into the next year or so is affordability. That seems to be the hot word in politics right now. Both sides, Republicans and Democrats, are starting to use it. And if we can figure out a way to frame these issues as issues of affordability, in addition to offering consumers choice, I think that's where we can make some real progress.
Great point. And on those topics, there's also the FEMA Review Council or Advisory Council here that's coming out with their recommendations supposedly in the next week or two. Any idea what they might have in there? I know there's certainly been meetings with the Review Council by a lot of different industries, I'll put it that way, that want to have influence over their recommendations. Any thoughts on that as we approach their draft, what we're being told as draft recommendations?
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball, but they're holding their cards pretty tight. I know the overarching goal of that, it was kind of piggybacking on DOGE in some ways, right, and talk government efficiency. And so, I can see their suggestions, and at the end of the day, they're just suggestions, right? They're just making recommendations. What they come up with is not codified into law. It's nothing that will be enacted unless there's further action beyond that. But I could see them trying to grant states more authority when we talk about FEMA, disaster response, mitigation. And I don't know how much they'll touch on the NFIP. We've certainly encouraged them to weigh in and say, we need a long-term reauthorization. The program needs to be reformed. Another overarching goal would just be encouraging Congress and the administration to find ways to increase take-up rates, whether it's NFIP or private market, right? We need more people understanding that flood insurance is important to have, whether or not you're in a flood zone or, live near a major river or one of the oceans. People, need to be educated more that flood insurance is an important risk mitigation factor.
I think that's the biggest misconception out there is that, people aren't in a flood zone. And the fact of the matter is most are either in a low hazard or a high hazard. There's very few places that haven't been mapped. So, it's something that I've been in this 23 years now and always trying to overcome that, to get insurers to understand if it can rain where you live, it can flood, right? So, so my last question would be, obviously the private market absorbed quite a bit of business during the shutdown, right? I don't think, the coastal stuff, maybe not so much, but given this, how do you see the long-term balance between the NFIP and private flood evolving, kind of specifically looking at privatization or some sort of hybrid model, gaining traction on Capitol Hill, more of kind of a partnership between the NFIP and private market?
Yeah, I think that would be a perfect scenario is where we find that balance.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I don't know how much the NFIP will grow in the future, right? But I could definitely see the private market growing more significantly and actually, taking on more customers, policyholders that aren't purchasing flood insurance right now. And the real question is, how do we bring that education to those potential future, policyholders that they do need it, as we just talked about. I think there's significant opportunity as we look at how quick technology's advancing, right? Whether we talk about, aerial imagery, whether we talk about other ways, creative ways of quote mapping the risk, looking at the use of AI and other tools. I think there will be some actors in the private market that really want to come in, have that appetite for absorbing risk if they can educate people about the need to have flood insurance. So that was a political answer for you. I didn't say much. I just kind of wandered around and straddled the fence.
That's a tough question. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those crystal ball things like you mentioned earlier. Like, it's tough to tell how it's going to play out. But, me being in Florida here, I always have said, like, it surprises me that NFIP hasn't gone down the road of kind of being that insurer of last resort, and letting the private market take out more of the business there that, can be rated, and I see the NFIP maybe one day becoming just the severe repetitive loss and kind of the really cat prone areas versus all the good risk that, is out there that would be more towards the private market. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, we've had discussions between Chad and I about, where legislatively and programmatically this is going to go. And certainly we've all seen some of the position papers from different companies and places and industries on where the NFIP may end up going. But what I've found interesting over the last 5 to 10 years is that private and NFIP are charting their own path, whether we determine that path or not. And it's certainly headed in a certain direction, whether Congress intervenes or not. So while it's very interesting to see what happens and agree with all the points made on where we're headed legislatively or what needs to be done legislatively, 20 years ago, the balls were or less than that with some of the bigger Waters Act stuff and some of the stuff that had happened in the industry before then. The ball kind of started to roll. So we're certainly in an interesting place. And Nathan, we really appreciate you coming on here today
Yes.
and sharing your perspective, because as we've kind of talked about today, it's not over. And we've certainly, not just in this short-term CR, but the focus now also has to be, to your point earlier, some of the long-term pieces and other reforms that are coming down the pike here that industry wants to push. So so thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan.
Absolutely, great to be with you guys. I appreciate everything that you're doing to educate the public, and this is a great podcast. So best of luck in the future with it.
Thank you so
very
much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.